Welcome, everyone, to Beyond Belief, Aisha's Thursday night program. We are so excited to have Ambassador Michael Oren joining us tonight. It's a tremendous, tremendous treat. Just to introduce the Ambassador Michael Oren has devoted his life to serving Israel and the Jewish people. He was a member of the Knesset starting in 2015, and as a deputy minister in the Prime Minister office, he interacted with foreign leaders and defended Israel in the media and beyond. Prior to that, from 2009 to 2013, he served as Israel's ambassador to the United States. He was instrumental in obtaining U.S. defense aid, especially for the Iron Dome system and American loan guarantees for Israel's economy. He is a graduate of Princeton and Columbia, and Dr. Oren was a visiting professor at Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown. He has written a number of books, and three of his books, 6 Days of War, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, and Ally, my journal across the American-Israel divide, were all New York Times bestsellers. It's really our honor to have an Ambassador Oren. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on Beyond Belief.
Great. Good to be with you, Rabbi Thias. And good to be with Aish, as always.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with a personal question. What does a 24-year-old, I think you're probably about 24 years old, graduate of Columbia, growing up in the suburbs of New Jersey, right? You're from West Orange. I actually live in Livingston, so not so far away. What is a 24-year-old? You're living the life. You're on the American dream path. What made you at that point pick up and emigrate to Israel?
That's funny. My parents asked exactly the same question. I want you to know, and so did a lot of my friends. Sure. Listen, a lot of it had to do with how I grew up, when I grew up, where I grew up. I grew up in the post-World War II period. Grew up with a sense of almost like acquired guilt about the American Jewish community and what it didn't do to save European Jewry during World War II. My father had fought in that war. Landed on Normandy Beach, went through the whole war with his brother. They liberated a concentration camp. They took pictures of the horrors that they saw there. I actually carry those pictures in my cell phone with me wherever I go to remind me. And I grew up in a working class neighborhood, not Livingston. I was the only Jewish kid in the block, and I used to get the heck beaten out of me for being Jewish and encountered an awful lot of anti-Semitism. And every time I'd come home all beaten up, my father would open up this album with the pictures of the concentration camp. And he'd say to me, you see that, son? You see that? That's why we need a strong Israel. And I grew up in the period of the Six-Day War. And we all remember the great victory of the Six-Day War. But for American Jews at the time, it was 3 weeks before the war, were just hair-raising. We thought we would witness a second Holocaust within a single generation and that Israel would be destroyed. Nobody would do anything. And it was a profoundly impactful experience for me. And also, when I was 15, 16 years old, I sort of went on a spiritual journey. I grew up in a highly assimilated home. Not only did we not keep kosher, we didn't even know what kosher was. Jewish holidays, not much. I don't think anybody in my entire family knew what a page of Talmud looked like. And so at the age of 15, 16, I also went on a spiritual journey. I found a great rabbi who taught me Gemara. And also I started going to Israel. I started going to Israel almost every summer. I would work raking leaves and mowing lawns to save enough money to go to Israel and work for free on a kibbutz. Wasn't the best farmer in the world, but I certainly loved it. And it was also when I was 15, 16 that I met Israel's ambassador to the United States. And I shook his hand and I said, okay, that's what I want to be when I grow up. And his name was Yitzhak Rabin. I ended up being an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin many years later. And later after that, I was able to realize my dream was really a lifelong dream of being Israel's ambassador to the United States.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable if your father, the journey that he was on, and to see where his son went, unbelievable what you've accomplished. And you mentioned a lot of things there. You mentioned the Six-Day War. You wrote the book on the Six-Day War. I want to come back to that a little bit later. Sure. But when you're talking there about the Holocaust, and I guess what sort of flashed into my mind was, we just obviously had Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, the idea a week before Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the juxtaposition of many people looking at, well, Israel was the ultimate never again, that Israel was the place that Jews can come after thousands of years of anti-Semitism. And yet, for so long, even though Israel, I think, was that symbol, it was so dependent on American Jewry. It was so dependent on other countries. And my sense now is that, my sense, but really I want your opinion, is that maybe we're in a different place today. Israel's in a different place. Maybe we'll start with vis-a-vis Israel, America, because as you were the ambassador, you were there so many years, right? Israel was so dependent on American aid. How do you see that today? Is Israel a superpower? Is Israel able to be an independent actor in today's world, or are they still so dependent on America?
That's an excellent question. And it's one that I dealt with as ambassador, but it's also one that I've dealt with since coming back from being ambassador. Now, according to every international criteria, whether it be average per capita GDP, life expectancy, defense, social mobility, education, certainly health, Israel is a superpower. We are ranked as the 8th most powerful country in the world. A state the size of New Jersey that has 10 million inhabitants is the 8th most powerful country in the world. And and you're right, it is significantly different than the state I came to in the 1970s, which was a largely lower middle class country surrounded by enemies all sides. We didn't have peace with Egypt, with Jordan, certainly not with the countries of the Abraham Accords. We had an alliance with the United States, but it wasn't a fast and strong alliance. We are very much alone in the world. We didn't have relations with China, with Russia, with all the Soviet bloc countries, with Africa, with most of the South American countries. We were really alone in the world. So, we needed that type of alliances. And it was Ben Gurion's thought that Israel should always have a great power alliance with Britain, France, the United States later. We should always have that great power alliance. You flash forward, these 40 years, and Israel's in a very different place. And I got to tell you honestly, and I hope I'm not going to be too controversial, that I was the only member of Israel's government to oppose President Obama's aid package to Israel. And I opposed it for many reasons. But the overall reason was that, okay, Israel now at 70 plus years is strong, and that we have to stand on our own 2 feet. And that the message we give to the world, as long as we continue to get this aid, by the way, which comes with a tremendous amount of strings. There's no such thing as a free lunch, even with military aid. Mm-hmm. It's sending a sort of a wrong message of dependency and weakness. I think we have to stand on our own 2 feet. We can stand on our own 2 feet. And frankly, to put a finer point on it, we're going to have to stand on our own 2 feet because the majority of Americans today, whether it be Democrats or Republicans, are very ambivalent about playing that role of being the world's policeman anymore. They're very much trying to figure out how to police the United States and not how to police the world. And America is just not in a position today to project a large-scale military power anywhere in the world, including the Middle East. So whether we like it or not, we're pretty much on our own.
Mm-hmm. So you obviously you're focusing there mainly on military support, military aid, obviously as the ambassador dealing with diplomacy as well. And America traditionally, I know you when you were under theirs and under the Obama presidency, there was some interesting times, interesting votes in the UN, etc. Yeah. But America being a friend of Israel, even let's say we don't have aid, military aid, we don't have, but just that the diplomatic support, how important is that? And I just add a second question. Seeing what's happening in America today, there's still tremendous support for Israel, but you start seeing now Congress people who are clearly, anti-Israel, pro-BDS, even anti-Semitic. Could you see a time where Americans were not pro-Israel?
It'd be difficult for me to see. I think the American-Israel relationship is a very special relationship. It is actually essentially different than any other bilateral relationship the United States has with any country in its post-World War II period, because it rests on some 3 pillars. There's really no other country in the world that has those 3 pillars. It's shared democratic values. And Israel is one of the 5 or 6 countries in the world that has never known a second of non-democratic governance, even though we're the only country on that list that's never known a second of peace. Israel is a military ally, and that military alliance is very deep and multifaceted. It is weapons development, it is intelligence sharing, it is certainly cyber defense, where Israel is a world leader in cyber defense, extremely deep. And there's also the spiritual ties. And if you would ask me, I think that's the strongest pillar. America was, I think it still is, the most religiously observant country in the industrialized world. More people go to a house of worship in the United States than in any other modernized country. And certainly for the people reading their Bible, And they see that, that where God says, I will bless those who bless my people. And they see that we are native to this land. They take that very seriously, Americans. Now, I'm concerned about the rapid fall off in church attendance. We actually have an interest in people going to church in Israel. But it's still, relative to Europe, where the churches are empty completely, and they're selling off churches in Europe. They can't even
it's so interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
So I don't think America is on a rapid, on a fast track to being anti-Israel or changing the alliance. But America is changing. There are processes undergoing in America over which Israel has no control, whether it be cancel culture or white supremacy or anything. Israel doesn't have control over that. And there are processes that are happening here. Now, not all of them are negative. As I said before, Israel has become a strong country. And while we will always value our alliance with the United States, and it is our ultimate alliance, it's going to be fundamentally different than it was. Many years ago when I was a paratrooper serving in the siege of Beirut, you may remember this. I don't know if you probably weren't born yet.
I was born, but it was a while ago.
We were sitting getting shot at in Beirut, and we thought, okay, we get in too much of a hot water, the Americans will send the Marines. And the Marines, in fact, came. They came twice. That's not going to happen today. Israel gets into a fix. The Marines aren't coming so fast. And we can expect diplomatic support to a certain degree from this administration. I think if Israel were to build in a large extent in Judea and Samaria, in what some Americans still call East Jerusalem, I think this administration would come down very heavily on us. And then we have the very thorny, difficult, and extremely dangerous issue of the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, and let's talk about that a second, and sort of segueing what we were talking about, Israel being a superpower, Israel having to in some way stand on its own. Do you think Israel can stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon on its own?
I think Israel has the means to defend itself against any threat in the Middle East, any combination of Middle Eastern threats. Of course, I can't go into the details of our capabilities, but Israel has not just the ability, but also the right to defend itself.
Right. And I mean, it's been so interesting. A lot of the reasons you gave before, I feel, for U.S. support for Israel really have nothing to do with politics. They're beyond. They're really, meta. They're religious support. They're shared values. But yet we've seen through different administrations different types of support for Israel. Indeed. What, based on your experience, especially, I mean, now President Biden is his own person, his own administration, but a lot of ties to the Obama administration. What do you think we should be looking at in the next year or a couple of years of relationship between Israel and America under the Biden administration?
Let me say this. I think that President Biden is someone I know very, very well. It's not well known, but for most of my term as ambassador in Washington, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually boycotted the Israeli embassy and wouldn't take my phone calls. That was part of the Obama administration's attempt to take us down a few notches, and it worked. But by then Vice President Biden was my what they call POC, my point of contact in the administration. I logged a lot of hours with him, and I was enormously fond of him and impressed by him. Deeply pro-Israel, deeply committed to the alliance between our two countries, to Israel's security. I worked extensively with his then foreign policy expert, Tony Blinken, now the Secretary of State. I worked extensively with the then head of policy planning at the State Department, Jake Sullivan, is now the National Security Advisor. I know the people in this administration, down to the second and third tier. They are all that way. They're all deeply committed to Israel's security and the alliance. Having said that, though, there will be. I'm going to have to take that, okay? That wasn't supposed to
Sure.
go off. Okay. Having said that, though, there are policy differences. This is a Democratic administration. The Democratic administration supports a two-state solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is based on the 67 borders with mutually agreed swaps, probably a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. It supports renewing aid to Palestinian agencies like UNRWA, which Israel views as a disaster for the Palestinians. It's first and foremost a disaster for the Palestinians. By renewing that aid, the administration is not doing the Palestinians any favors. It's actually hurting them. and opposing, Israeli building in our homeland, in Judea and Samaria and in Jerusalem. We'll have a difference there, but the biggest difference is going to be the Iran deal, and that is a matter not just of politics, Rabbi Matthias. That is a matter of national security and even perhaps of Israel's survival.
Well, we have a lot to be on the lookout. Let's shift a little bit away from the U.S. government and maybe to Israeli Jewish diaspora relations. And obviously, when you're ambassador in the Knesset, but being born in America, now living in Israel, I'm sure you have some very unique inside views on this. I tend to see that the same sort of trends that I was mentioning before, as Israel's become stronger. Again, of course, my parents, my grandparents telling the stories of rushing to the synagogues to give money, into the pushka boxes to be sent to Israel during, the 6-Day War, et cetera. That always a sense that, that American Jewry were there to support Israel. And what's so fascinating to me now is just in the last, it's been a number of years now that the Israeli government putting money to support diaspora Jewry, whether it's Birthright, whether it's to fight BDS, whether there's other projects going on, some controversial, some not, to strengthen Jewish identity amongst diaspora Jewry being paid by Israelis. It seems like such a change in the relationship. Do you see it that way?
I have an historic perspective. As a historian, I can tell you, say that American Jews always supported the state of Israel. In fact, it wasn't true. They supported Israel to a certain extent during the 1948 War of Independence. Major American Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Committee were not pro-Israel, not pro-Zionist. They kept their distance. During the 1956 war, the Second Arab-Israeli War, American Jews did not support Israel. During the 1967 war, this I remember personally, thousands and thousands of Jews went out to protest against the Vietnam War, but not in favor of Israel. There were no huge protests in support of Israel during those 3 horrible weeks while the Arab armies gathered around us and threatened to throw us into the sea. There weren't. It was really after 1967. 1967 was the watershed. And that's where the American Jewish organizations became very pro-Israel. And for a certain period, but even after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, it began to it began to drop off. No one had ever heard of the Palestinians before 1973. And when you said the word Palestinian in the United States, it usually referred to a Palestinian Jew before 1948. And suddenly Arafat is speaking before the UN, and the Palestinian issue becomes the big thing. The settlement issue. No one ever said anything about Israeli settlements before, and it created divisions with the American Jewish community and tensions with the parts of that community and the state of Israel. And historically also, Israel had not supported American Jewry. And you're right on that. The money was flowing in one direction. It still flows significantly, you should know, that American and diaspora contributions and investments in Israel account for 6.5% of our national wealth, which is the equivalent of our defense budget. So it's quite significant. Ask Israelis whether they want to give up their defense budget. Not so fast. They're quick to criticize American Jews, but not so fast about giving up the defense budget. I think it's fitting, to tell you the truth. I think there's an historic justice in all this. We have become the largest Jewish community in the world. We have become, in many ways, certainly the strongest Jewish community in the world. While as Judaism itself, in so many parts of diaspora communities, particularly in the American Jewish community, Jewish life, Jewish learning is being challenged by assimilation. Here, Jewish learning is thriving, and this country becomes more observant every year, not less observant every year. More people go to a synagogue every year than less. I live in southern Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and I must tell you that Tel Aviv Judaism is different than Jerusalem Judaism, and southern Tel Aviv Judaism is different than northern Tel Aviv Jerusalem. I live in an area where it's a fusion of Kalibach and Moroccan and Algerian. It's just fabulous what's going on. The spiritual and Jewish effervescence of this country. It's just remarkable what's going on here, Jewishly, if you could use that word.
Yeah.
And it's very uplifting. So we have a lot to give. And I would be very emphatic in saying that it is Israel's duty and our privilege as the nation state of the Jewish people to live up to that title and assure that the Jewish people remains committed and coherent and spiritually enriched as a people.
As you see those shifts, first of all, you talk. Oh, I heard an echo there. As you see the shift, as you mentioned again, whether it's militarily, whether it's economically, whether it's spiritually, seeing, it seems so obvious that you're talking about. I heard, recently there's more people learning Torah in Israel today than the history of the Jewish people, going back to the days of the Mishnah, going back to King David.
I don't know where they get those statistics. I didn't exactly have censuses back then, but okay.
Yes, it's widespread that there's a tremendous, and like you said, it's going beyond just the Orthodox. There is this sort of spiritual. I don't know if it's an awakening or if it's a connection, if it's a renewal. But I've always found it interesting and heard the discussion in amongst American Jewry. What is the role of the diaspora vis-a-vis Israel? Is it to be a cheerleader? And again, historically, I'm sure maybe there's times not, but let's say the AIPAC model, whatever the Israeli government basically does, we're going to support.
It's not exactly true. There are things that AIPAC doesn't support that the Israeli government does.
Yes,
there's things that the Israeli government gets kind of sore around the neck, or around the collar at AIPAC sometimes. You should know that too.
So, but there's a general sense that our duty as a diaspora Jew is to support Israel. And there's others that obviously are critical and are outspokenly critical of the current government, current policies. And there's those that feel, if you don't live in Israel, if you don't partake in the society here, if you don't live here, if you don't send your children to them, you shouldn't really have a say. You're an armchair critic. But we're one people, right? And many people feel so invested, even if they don't live in Israel, in what's happening there. How do you see that debate falling out?
I certainly think diaspora Jews have a right and a duty to make their opinions felt about issues that impact world Jewry, that impact the Jewish people wherever they are, and that's legitimate. On issues of security, foreign policy, I would advise diaspora Jews to be very, very restrained and self-critical, because at the end of the day, how many of these diaspora Jews, how many of them speak Hebrew, how many speak Arabic, how many actually know the issues here? I was on an interview with an American Jewish reporter, early reporting for a Jewish paper, who had, when I told him that if Israel made peace with the Palestinians, it would not impact in any way Iran's hatred of us. It would actually increase it. It came as a huge surprise to him. Okay, but that's a very fundamental fact. So, I would exercise caution if I was this person or someone like him, who really doesn't understand the dynamics, doesn't speak the language, doesn't know the history of this region. But I think, irrespective of whether people are cheerleading, as you say, or expressing criticism, the major factor is where it comes from. It's not even about where it's going, it's where it comes from. And it has to come from a very specific place. It has to come from a place of gratitude, because we are living in the most extraordinary period in all, I think, Jewish history, maybe since, certainly since Yemei Beit HaMikdash, the most extraordinary period where every single Jew in the world is free. And for most of my lifetime, there were 3 million Jews behind the Iron Curtain. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Africa who weren't free. This is an extraordinary moment in Jewish history. Extraordinary. We are in the two largest Jewish communities in history. We are both American Jews and Israeli Jews are members of immensely successful communities, strong, influential, affluent communities. Think about this. What a remarkable moment this is in our historical context. I don't know, nothing. And Jewish learning thriving since the days of the great academy of Eretz Yisrael and Babylonia, really thriving. So it is this truly miraculous moment. And if you are coming from that place of recognition and gratitude, if you're coming from a place of love for Israel, love for the Jewish people, then cheerleading or criticism takes on a completely different context.
It's when you talk about that, the we are in such a unique place in history that, like you say, being alive now and seeing what's happening with Israel. I'm interested. How do you see Israel's role in the world? which is a funny, question that maybe we couldn't even ask, right? Not long ago. But where do you see it today, and where do you think it could go? As Israel keeps getting stronger, as Israel keeps hopefully not having to only worry about defending itself and starting to develop into the dream, let's say, that the Jewish people had. Where do you see Israel's role today? What can the world learn from Israel, and where do you see Israel's role today in the world?
I think Israel is the model for the world in the 21st century. And I say that, without reservation. And why is that? Well, for one thing, we respect our tradition. We invest in our tradition. We enrich our tradition. At the same time that we are rated #1 in the world in terms of investing in innovation and modernity. So we prove to the world that you can be traditional and ultra modern at the same time, that there's no contradiction. In fact, they're mutually dependent and mutually, I think, enriching. We prove to the world that you can be a thriving democracy, and we are a flagrant democracy. You see, we're going to elections. We just love going to elections so often. But we can also be a democracy at arms. We can defend ourselves. And the Israel Defense Forces today, believe it or not, are more than twice as large as the British and French armies combined. Think about that. Think of that. It shows we can be democratic, we can be liberal, we can be an open society, we can give rights. We have rights to the peoples and communities that don't have rights anywhere else in this Middle East. Israel has the only growing Christian population in the entire Middle East. We are Israeli Arab Christians are per capita more affluent, better educated than Israeli Jews. This is a time where Christian communities are being eradicated everywhere else around us, whether it be women's rights, gay rights. I mean, Israel is that model. We show, and we are forging the 21st century. At the same time, we are preserving the first, second, third, and fourth centuries. And I think that is a source of great pride for me to be a part of that.
What are the things that concern you most, or you feel are the biggest challenges that Israel faces right now?
Well, we're going to face a challenge from the Iranians, particularly if this Iran deal is renewed, because that's going to then flood Iran with hundreds of billions of dollars in cash. They will use that not for schools and hospitals. They'll use it to build more missile sites, support more terror, and ultimately through that deal, they will get the bomb. The deal does not block Iran's path to the bomb. It paves Iraq's path to the bomb. I've worked on this subject now for well over a decade. And if you want to read an article recently that I published in the Atlantic Monthly about this Israel's position on the JCPOA, I would recommend you do it. It's a very complicated issue, but I think this article sets it out in a way that anybody can understand it. I worry about our brain drain. I worry about the cost of living in this country, the cost of housing in this country, which is forcing many young people to look abroad. I mean, when I meet young Israelis in Europe, in Germany even, invariably they say to me, listen, I didn't leave because of Hezbollah. I didn't leave because of doing reserve duty. I left because I can't support my family. I can't get a house. Israel has the second most expensive grocery basket of any country in the world after Japan. We have the largest income gap, social gap of any country in the world after the United States, Chile, and Mexico. This is a Jewish state. These are serious problems for this country. And then we have a problem of our relationship to the religious establishment, particularly with the Haredi communities, not all the Haredi communities, but those who are unwilling to recognize the sovereignty of the democratically elected government of Israel and its decisions, and those who are unwilling to give their kids basic education, the basic education that they need to contribute to Israeli societies, much less defend Israel's borders. And as those populations, those communities continue to grow, 30, 40 years from now, they will begin to challenge Israel's viability as a modern state.
Okay, I'm so excited to ask you this next question because this is one of my favorite things to quote when I read your 6 Days of War, the book on the 6-Day War, and I learned so much from it. And one of my favorite, as a rabbi, I'm always looking for deeper meanings and things. And you write about on the first day, as Israel Air Force sends off its planes for the preemptive strike to basically attack the Egyptian Air Force as it's basically still sitting on the tarmac, and they're going to attack the planes there. And they obviously had to go there in a stealth way so that the radar would not pick them up, and they were doing all kinds of things, flying low, doing things not to get picked up. As you write, the Jordanians had incredibly advanced radar that they were given by the British, and they picked up on their radar something very abnormal, the amount of Israeli planes that were going towards Egypt. And the person who was manning the radar sent the code to Amman. I think the code he wrote there was grapes. I think, if I remember, grape or grapes was the code. And the Jordanians sent the alert to the Egyptians in Cairo that there was something very strange going on that they picked up in this radar. But the day before, the Egyptians had changed their code deciphering, and they didn't tell the Jordanians. And so they were not able to receive that code. And when I read that, and to me, there's only two options there. One is just the most tremendous incompetence that you can possibly find on that level, or the other is there's some sort of divine providence protecting the Jewish people. Where do you see that in history, that a code, the Israelis were caught, but they changed the code the day before and they couldn't find it? If there is any more flavor to give to that story, I'd love to hear. But secondly, as a historian of not only but of Jewish history, of Israeli history, are there maybe another example or something else you've seen that, wow, you just look at and say, this does not go according to the laws of war. This does not go into the laws of nature. There's something else going on here.
There are so many. I don't know where to begin. Let's throw out just this one. Okay, Theodor Herzl, attending the Dreyfus trial in the 1890s in Paris. He was a highly assimilated Jew. Not until he encountered French anti-Semitism began to think about the possibility of someday creating a Jewish state in the land of Israel. He goes out and writes this book, The Jewish State. And overnight, Herzl, a playwright, a journalist, becomes the leader and founder of the modern Zionist movement. And it was during a chance meeting with Herzl in Minsk that a young scientist, a young then medical student named Chaim Weizmann, gets converted to Zionism. And then Weizmann can't get a job in Austria, so he has to move from his medical school to Great Britain, where he can get a job as a chemist. And Great Britain gets involved in World War I. And in 1916, when the British are running out of shells to fire on the Western Front, Chaim Weizmann invents acetone. He finds out that a certain type of fermented corn, when you set fire to it, will explode. And this brings Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist, into contact with the British government and with the British Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour, and who also becomes a Zionist because he's a Christian Zionist. And this is an amazing thing. So Weizmann and Balfour go to the British government and say, look, British forces are fighting in Palestine now. They're kicking out the Turks. Once the Turks are kicked out, why don't we make a declaration that will promise that the Palestine will be given to the Jewish people as a homeland? And the British government goes back to Balfour and Weizmann and says, what are you, crazy? Those Arabs, they have all the oil. We need those oil for our warships. We can't do that. So the only hope was that if Weizmann and Balfour could convince the Americans to support this declaration. Now, America was not in the war yet, but the British very much wanted the Americans in the war, World War I. The president of the United States was a gentleman named Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson had an interesting friend. He had a friend named Louis Brandeis, who would become the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And a chance meeting in, I think, 1904 between Brandeis and a Zionist editor in Boston converted Brandeis, who was also a highly assimilated Jew, to Zionism. And so we actually have a date for this. We know it's in May 1917 that Balfour and Weizmann show up in Washington. They meet with Brandeis. They said, listen, we need your help. Without American support for this declaration, Britain's never going to issue this declaration. And Brandeis goes into the Oval Office. He has like a 10-minute meeting with Woodrow Wilson, comes out with support of American support for this declaration. Woodrow Wilson, again, a religious Presbyterian. Back then, the Presbyterians were very Zionist. He says, to think that I would have a chance. He was the son of and grandson of Protestant ministers. To think that I, the son of these ministers, would have a chance of restoring the Jewish people to their homeland, he said. So Weizmann and Balfour go back to Britain. In November, the Balfour Declaration is issued. It becomes the basis of the British mandate in Palestine, which in turn becomes the basis of the 1947 UN partition resolution that creates the Jewish state in the land of Israel. Now, you know, as an historian, I can put all this together and say, okay, coincidences, processes happen in history. Some of them are a little bit more unusual than others. And in Israel, certainly as Israeli figures, believe it or not, we don't talk about God. We don't talk about our faith in Israel. It's not like America. You have to do that. But as an individual, as a Jew, there is no doubt in my mind that there is a purpose to Jewish history, that there's a purpose for our being here, and there was an intention behind the events that led us to be here. And I believe that, as they say, all my soul and all my might.
Wow. I heard a rumor that that you have taken up the studying of Daf Yomi, the page of Talmud, every day.
Yeah, it's about time, don't you think?
Fantastic. I started the cycle
We're
too.
doing Yoma now. We're doing Yoma. I learned about priestly headgear today.
Yes, it's an interesting topic. And by the way, I mean, just not going to get off into too much. I wasn't going to bring up going into the pages of the Talmud right now, but it is interesting that there's the tractate, which is the current tractate that we're in, which is the tractate about Yom Kippur. And
Right.
Today, if you think of Yom Kippur, you think of a day of fasting, you think of a day of atonement, and obviously that is. But really, I think it's 7 out of 8 chapters of the tractate in the Talmud actually talks about the high priest service in the temple.
Amazing.
And to me, when I look at that, I said, really, what is Yom Kippur about? Yom Kippur is about the temple. It's about the Jewish people being in their homeland, collectively as a nation, being focused together with like a unified purpose and a higher purpose of why we're here, that we're not just here to defend ourselves and we're not just here to survive, but really having this higher purpose. But I was going to ask you, I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned originally in your story coming to Israel, making Aliyah, you studied Old Talmud, there was a rabbi, but I think, like you said, you're in South Tel Aviv, right? Which is not Mea Shearim. What inspired you to want to study Torah, study the page of Talmud? And I'm interested just what's been your perspective on it since you've been doing it.
There are several perspectives, whether it be a matter of faith, which I have, but it's also reconnecting with my people. It's reconnecting with my people throughout the ages, not just in South Tel Aviv. And I'm reading the pages that generations upon generations of Jews have read and revered and studied. And that sense of connectedness is a source of great fulfillment for me and fascination.
Beautiful. So unfortunately, I mean, I'd be curious, what do you, I was gonna to give a segue to, unfortunately, many Jews in America don't have that perspective. Maybe it's true in Israel as well. I mean, on one hand, there is, like we talked about before, maybe a reawakening, a reconnection. But when we talk about sort of seeing, you used, I think there was the bigger purpose of history, the bigger purpose of we're here. Do you feel most Israelis see that? Is it just the day-to-day dealing with life, or do you think most Israelis see that bigger picture of the why, not just the what and what we have to endure, but the why the Jewish people are in Israel and what that purpose is?
I think it depends on the level. Some at a very visceral or even subliminal level would feel that. If you dig deep enough, I think you're going to find something to that level. And some people, it's more overt and pervasive. That would be me. I definitely feel that there's a purpose to our being here, and the purpose is not just about the Jewish people. I think the purpose is the world.
Right.
When we stand up against the Iranian nuclear threat, we are standing up not just for ourselves. We're standing up for the world, even though we are in the forefront of that battle.
One of the unfortunately, and we mentioned this before, that amongst American Jewry, diaspora Jewry, especially young diaspora Jewry, the connection, it seems, at times is getting weaker and weaker. Connection to their Judaism, connection to the Jewish community, even though there's amazing programs like Birthright and other things, connection to Israel. And of course, one of the things we've been dealing with over the last number of years is BDS, which I know you spent a lot of time fighting and trying to battle. College campuses today, a 19-year-old student who's maybe seeing on television, seeing Israel as a militaristic state, is hearing about BDS on their campus, that Israel's committing war crimes, and just a general sense that Israel's the bad guy. What would be your message to that student who probably is not so connected, doesn't know so much, doesn't have so much of the context? What might inspire them to maybe see things a little bit differently?
There's only one thing that would inspire. That's actually being here.
Hmm.
And if they haven't been here, then it's maybe far, far easier to reach the type of negative conclusions that they're being fed on these campuses. I mean, you could be critical about it. You can be a little snide about it and say, hey, how would you like it if I gave this type of criticism of the United States of America, but I knew nothing of American history. I knew nothing of American governance. I never read the Constitution, and I don't even know English. How'd you feel about that? And commenting about issues that affect you, the fundamental security, if not the survival of you and your family. How would you like that? That's a snide answer. The other answer is, come and see the reality, and don't jump to the conclusions that these people want you to lead.
Right. A lot of the pressure that, like I mentioned, the BDS movement, there's been a lot of, there's an organized campaign, not only on college campuses, on social media, in international bodies, to demonize Israel, to put pressure on Israel. That the BDS movement is just a tactic, but it's the latest tactic that we've seen. Do you think BDS is anti-Semitic?
Yes, of course it is. Of course it is.
And why, if someone would answer, well, it's just passive protest.
No, it's not passive. BDS, though it sometimes tries to portray itself as a peace-loving organization that aspires to create a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, if you read its manifesto, you read its constitution, it's designed to eradicate the state of Israel. And by denying the Jewish people, the only people in the world, the right to self-determination, of course, it's anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic by the definition even of the European Union and of the UN, certainly of the United States. So there's no question that it's anti-Semitic. There are going to be many Jews who are going to support it and say it's not. I'm Jewish. How can I be anti-Semitic? Well, guess what? You can be. And I think that is not the question. The issue about BDS is how it can be fought. And I was proud in the immediate aftermath of my term as ambassador to forward an idea to a number of congressmen about denying federal aid, federal funds to academic organizations in the United States that called for boycotting Israel. And I was accused of being anti-free speech, et cetera. And I said, look, listen, people can say whatever they want to on campus, but doesn't mean the American taxpayer has to pay for it. And my point of reference, strangely enough, was the anti-Arab boycott legislation that was promoted by President Jimmy Carter, not always the greatest friend of Israel and the Jewish people. And I simply took that same type of legislation that was used against economic boycotts and used it against academic boycotts. And now something of the order of 26 states have adopted that legislation.
Wow.
Very proud of that.
Amazing. Well, so you don't always get to look back and see the impact of your work. So I'm sure that's very gratifying. That's amazing. The goal of BDS is to isolate Israel. I believe it hasn't accomplished, let's say, much economically directly in what it says it wants to do, but it's to isolate Israel. It's to isolate Israel's supporters. That's what we're seeing on college campuses. That if someone supports Israel, they try to basically paint them as an extremist, isolate them. But what's so interesting to me, and I think, again, taking a step back and looking at the unique position of Israel, is that Israel is not isolated. Israel is more integrated, I believe, in the world than we've seen in many years.
And
in the Middle East, look at the Abraham Accords of what's been happening. And I guess my question for you is really, one is I'd be just interested in your analysis of the Abraham Accords in general. As a historian, how does this fit in? What is where do you see this going? And maybe as a side point, which is just interesting to me, I've heard some people say this, is this really a change of heart in the Middle East from the Arab world? Or is this just a convenience of, we have a common enemy called Iran. Iran is probably a bigger, well, let's say as big a threat to many of these other Middle Eastern countries there to Israel. And this is a temporary, convenient relationship that might change in the future. As a historian, how do you see that?
I think it's a total game changer.
Hmm.
The Abraham Accords overturned long-held and widely held assumptions about the Middle East, about the Arab-Israeli conflict, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a tremendous peace industry in the world, particularly in the United States. It's in virtually every university. It's the think tanks. It's much of the media, which was based on a set of assumptions that Israel had to make peace with the Palestinians before it made peace with any Arab states, that Israel would have to give up territory, would have to give up Judea and Samaria and half of Jerusalem, that Israel would have to uproot settlements, tens and tens of thousands of people would have to be uprooted. And guess what? It's all false. All of those assumptions are false. And there's also the assumption that Israel did make peace, such as the peace we have with Jordan and with Egypt. There would be peace first and normalization later, which in fact never happened with Egypt and Jordan. We don't have normal relations with them. Peace, yes. Normalization, no. With the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco and Sudan, we have normalization first. We have peace between our peoples. We have dozens of flights going back and forth every week. There's now inaugurating a direct flight between Israel and Bahrain. So it just, all of the paradigms have not just shifted, they've been turned on their heads. And I guarantee you that any future peace arrangement between Israel and any Arab country will not look like the Israeli-Egyptian peace. It'll look like the Israeli-Bahraini peace. That's the new paradigm. So it's turned on the head. Believe me, Palestinians know this. The people in BDS know this. They know that on this level, they are not winning. They may be winning on American campuses, but they're not actually winning in the place where it really counts, which is in the Middle East. So it is a big game changer. These countries are not democracies. They could be overthrown. A different government could come into being. But I think what we are building is a peace from the bottom up. And we're going to have so many strong economic and strategic ties that, irrespective of who's in power, it'll be very difficult to break them in the future. And there are many reasons for this. We talk about an Arab world, but in fact, there's no Arab worlds. Like there's no American Jewish community. There are many American Jewish communities. And there are many different countries in the Arab world. There's Syria and there's Bahrain and Oman. And they're very, very different. And I think that these countries that have pioneered and spearheaded the Abraham Accords are the people saying, well, what, you got to be crazy. Well, we're going to stay in 1948. We're going to be left behind 100 years soon because of the Palestinians who will never come to the negotiating table. They said they have turned down every offer of a two-state solution since the 1930s. We're gonna be beholden to that. We're going to be enslaved to that. No, we want to move ahead. Israel's strong. Israel's dynamic. And yes, we need Israel against Iran, particularly as the United States continues to withdraw from the Middle East and the world.
It's just amazing to me. It's hard. I don't know how someone doesn't look at what's happening in Israel and just be optimistic. Do you feel that way? Do you feel when there's obviously ebbs and flows, and there's obviously, you talked about before, there's dangers and challenges. But again, when you as a historian, as someone who's been in the trenches, also as a diplomat, but also has been able to take a step back as a historian, are you optimistic about the future of Israel, the future of the Jewish people?
I have to be. I mean, you cannot look at what the Jewish people have endured in the last century alone, and remember that this country arose almost 3 years to the date after the end of World War II, surrounded by enemies at all sides. 600,000 Jews in this country, about the population of Boston. Those of you who are from Boston, no natural resources, no allies, and look what we made. Look what we made. I have seen in my own lifetime miracle after miracle. It's the aliyah of nearly 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union, the aliyah of tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews. I've seen this country emerge from being a lower middle class backwater to being a powerhouse, a logical military powerhouse. I've seen it all, and I'm amazed by it. Does that mean I am cavalier about the future? I am not. And I'm not Pollyannish about the future. Israel has to begin to prepare for its second century. And there are fundamental changes and policies which we must adopt. I mentioned the relationship between Israel and our Haredi communities, Israel and its Arab citizens, which is happening even now, Israel and its foreign relations, Israel and its education system, Israel and the social gaps that I mentioned. Okay? All of these have to be addressed if we are to replicate the success of our first century in our second century. And that requires proactivism. I actually have an NGO called Israel 2048, which is doing just looking at the future and getting a vision for the future that recalls the vision of Herzl and Weizmann and Brandeis, when 50 years before the creation of the state, they're already thinking about what that state was going to look like. And we need that type of thought and conversation now.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Oren, for joining us tonight. Your work on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people in so many ways, as a diplomat, as a member of Knesset, as a historian, as an advocate, has been something that so many of us have found inspiring and someone that we can follow in so many ways. So we really appreciate everything that you've done. Thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of Aish, on behalf of Beyond Belief, just want to thank everyone for watching tonight. Please join us again next week. Next Thursday night, we'll be back. Please follow us on YouTube so you can get notifications of our next shows. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again to Ambassador Michael Oren, and thank you.